Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about this idea of the end of photography, really. We're going to be talking about kind of the introduction of the digital age and how it really changed the face of photography as we know it. So, we're starting out talking about this idea of globalism. So, the idea of globalism is defined as this: globalism is a process of international integration arising from changing worldviews, products, ideas, and other aspects of culture. So basically, what globalization is it's a lot of the Western influence really coming in and starting to influence the rest of the world through art, through culture, and really almost having this idea that we're all moving to the same place with artistic styles and with the work that we are doing. So the architecture of globalization had a big impact on a certain photographer from Germany. His name was Andreas Gursky. And so Gursky is known for taking photographs that kind of sum up globalization. A lot of times he would shoot these photographs so that they were extremely huge. He wanted to show a huge sense of scale and a huge sense of almost this loneliness and this massive change that was happening that we really hadn't seen since the times of something like the Industrial Revolution. He would often shoot contemporary buildings such as the Hong Kong Stock Exchange or even the German Parliament building. Now, when he printed these photos, because of the scale and because of the kind of grandeur that he wanted to capture in these photos, a lot of times he would print them extremely large, and he's very well known for that. Gursky would print his prints sometimes up to 10 feet wide, and they would always have this kind of shining, intense color to really, really capture your eye and bring you into this image. So something else that's visually identifying about his images, and really images that deal with globalism on a larger scale, was that they often used computer aid after the fact. They would make sure that they're taking advantage of the new technologies that were available and starting to use this kind of vast array of picture making tools that the photographers could now use in the digital age. It was no longer about capturing a moment. It was no longer about constructing an image. It was about really going in and a combination of the both, of capturing a moment, but then being able to go in and construct the image after the moment had been captured. So Gursky was really one of the pioneers in this idea of globalism and really in this kind of social change of photography, that he was seen as someone who painted with pixels. He was no longer kind of in that gray area of photography being a fine art, but then fine art being fine art. He was someone that merged those two, became known as a painter of pixels. So globalism wasn't a complete takeover. This is another one of Gursky's photos, and as you can see, that very, very large scale, showing kind of the change in culture that was happening in the world, and really, really capturing those bright, vivid colors that he loved so much. So globalism wasn't a complete change in culture. It was more of a merging. A lot of corporate logos and consumer goods started to reach into every corner of the world. The world started to become more westernized, more corporate, and a lot of aspects of cultural experience still remained local, but still there were these kind of large corporations, and the world was changing to be much more westernized, and that Western media really influenced the rest of the world. So the indigenous ways of life in a lot of these areas were disrupted and sometimes even destroyed by this invasion of Western culture. People saw the movements that were happening in the West. They saw the beautiful art that was happening, and they saw this some kind of X factor that people latched onto. Whether it was the celebrity, whether it was something that was different, whether it was something that was kind of edgy. People wanted to be like what was happening in the West. And so this idea of globalization really was kind of this invasion of the West, the corporate logos being everywhere, kind of the sell mentality that we have so much today started during this time of the digital revolution and this time of globalization. So globalization often kind of has a kickback of, while people kind of revolt against this idea of the corporations coming in and really creating this new culture, there was a kind of heightened appreciation for regional life and a lot of the locals. They saw that the world was changing, they saw that things were becoming westernized, and they wanted to preserve their way of life. And even though kind of the artistic change was unavoidable, they really wanted to capture and keep any part of their life that they really could. So, one of the photographers that was kind of fighting against this idea of globalization and kind of everything being a commodity was a photographer by the name of Felix Gonzalez Torres. So Felix Gonzalez Torres saw the world as it was changing. He saw that everything was becoming a commodity. Everything was a good or a service. And he was a Cuban-born artist. And what he did in one of his shows is that he printed out a stack of his photos and stacked them in a kind of large stack in the middle of the gallery. The idea was that the viewer could now come and take one of these prints. He also spread free candy all over the floor, wrapped candy, so that you could have a piece of candy if you wanted as well. And his idea was kind of against this idea of globalization and against the idea of everything being a commodity. He wanted to show that art is beautiful and art should be shared. And he really changed this idea of art being something that you experience, or you look at rather than experience. So the change that happened in the art world was that now the viewer could be a collaborator. That by taking one of these pieces, you were also latching onto the statement that he was trying to make. That he was trying to say everything is a commodity, globalization is bad, it's something that is lowering the idea of art. And so he turned all of his viewers into collaborators just by the simple idea of printing out the photos and letting people take as many as they wanted out of the middle of the studio. In the past, moving to a new country meant a lot of severing ties. But during this time, and Gonzalez Torres is a great example of this. During this time, immigrants that were traveling to the U.S. could still reach back to home. They could still experience their local culture even if they weren't local. And so this time really started a mixing of cultures, with the West obviously being heavily influenced on whatever was happening in the art world. But people started to merge in their own cultures. You could send photographs now through a laptop so that people back home could see the work that you're working on. And as never before in kind of the history of the art world and really the world, hybrid cultural identities started to be maintained through generations. So that someone could be working as a Cuban artist in America, and you could see the Cuban influences in their work, but also the westernization that had influenced them. So in the late 20th century, immigrants and descendants could really choose to hover between these two lines. Like we said, it was no longer about being a fully westernized version, and it was no longer about being kind of fully from wherever you were. You could start working in this hybrid zone. So because of that, and the idea of a lot of people immigrating into the U.S. And really immigrating around the world, there was a visual theme of this idea of crossing borders and the characteristics of crossing borders that became very popular during this time of globalization and digital revolution in the photography world. By the mid-1970s, photography had moved squarely into the art world. A lot of artists active in other media really started to integrate photo into their work. Either they would use photography as a direct medium, as in they're taking photos and creating art with whatever photos they take, or they would let the camera kind of document their process, that the camera would now become something that captured art, that also became art. A lot of photographers sensed this openness of what they could do with photography and what they could do with photographs, and started to move into creating photographs that were a sculpture or an installation. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about light writing, how you kind of go into the pantry, see what things you have, see how you can exploit them to create something new. That they were taking photo negatives, they were taking light-sensitive material and exposing them to light this is the same idea of taking, we have a photo, but what can we do with it? How can we advance the art world of photography? And so photographers like David Hockney started to work in photography and use photographs as a sculpture instead of just a photograph. He would create these giant collages out of snapshots of kind of Polaroid prints, and he would create this very large total picture that contained a myriad of different alterations, different angles, and kind of created this nice visual language. This is something that we talked about in Cubism, that he's kind of paying homage back to. That it's seeing the world through all these different angles at the same time, but somehow putting them together to create this beautiful image. So again, photography stopped being its own art form in itself, and started to become integrated as well into other art forms, so that photography could now be a sculpture. Photography could now be an installation. It was no longer just about having a photograph. Because of that, more photographers started to experiment and slice, crumpled, overprinted, overexposed, blurred, and even photos without a camera lens started to become welcome and accepted in the art world. Like we said, photography was really moving into being a support for the art world. And once the simple means, photography at that time, like we said, was being used to kind of record performance art. So it was being used to kind of be art, but artists and photographers hadn't really figured out how to use it in performance art. So they would kind of just be used to chronicle performance art. Here's how something's happening. Here is the piece that I did, and I photograph it so that I can have a physical proof, because performance art happens in a certain space for a certain time, for a certain message to be conveyed. So photography gradually started to become more and more integrated into the initial conception of the performance piece's ideas. Performance artists wanted to incorporate photography as a means and as part of their performance. So a French artist by the name of Orlan used photography to not just document her performance art, but to really become the piece of art that she was working toward. She was focused on conveying this idea of feminine beauty throughout art history, seeing things like the Mona Lisa and thinking that it's beautiful. And so she had a surgical remodeling of her face done over and over and over and over, and would record that with photography so that she could show, this is the piece that I've been working on, this is my performance art that's happening over a long time, but now that I can capture using photography. So at this point, all styles and really practices of photography had assimilated and really become art. Photography was now accepted in the art world, was now accepted in just the strictly documentary world, and really photo and documentary photography started to merge with art photography. Fashion and celebrities really started to have a social commentary to them. Where we've talked so many times about there being hard lines between photography and the art world, this is the time in the digital revolution and this age of globalism that those lines really became gray and blurred and really opened the world for photographic exploration. So with that, there was also a huge explosion in the passion for working with photography, specifically in nature and science. The bond between nature and photography and science really started to blur. Again, this is the time that photography was being integrated in all walks of life. It was becoming a fine art, it was becoming documentary, and now it started to merge with this idea of nature and really with the science world even. A lot of photographers wanted to really learn and document the depletion of the rainforest, global warming, extinction of species, and really started to take a custodial attitude toward the plant and toward the earth. They wanted to keep it, they wanted to maintain it, and they wanted to document it. We've looked at this before with the documenting of the Native American culture. Photographers wanted to capture something before it was gone forever. So with this idea of westernization and globalization and moving into the future, people saw that rainforests and kind of the beautiful things of the earth could not be around for much longer. So they wanted to capture those and have those moments and have those pieces so that they could see them and maintain them in the future. So a lot of photographers would work specifically in documenting the rainforest, a lot of time waterfalls, and kind of these beautiful monuments of the earth. In this example by Derek Johnson, you'll see that he is using this idea of really creating photography that is art, merging the worlds of digital and physical to really build and create this beautiful image that he wants to maintain. He wants to maintain the earth. He wants to bottle it up and keep it on a shelf so that everyone can come see it and see how beautiful it is. So the point of this piece is that he went out and captured all these beautiful things, but that he put them in bottles so that you can think of that idea and convey that emotion that this won't be here forever and we need to preserve it. Another photographer working with this idea of merging science and photography was Catherine Chalmers. So Catherine Chalmers was really focused on this idea of finding life and how life worked in the context of nature. She would work to use the latest digital imaging devices to a lot of times show cross sections of humans, to really show DNA, to show how life executed itself in the context of science. So this fascination and repulsion of nature, that it can be interesting but also disgusting, was really taken up by her as her passion. She would pose insects like cockroaches and praying mantises in front of shiny white backgrounds, almost like they were fashion models. And in this series called The Food Chain, which I highly suggest that you look up and kind of look into, Chalmers really adapted this idea of fashion photography to show nature and kind of this circle of life. A lot of these times they would start out with the two insects just kind of being almost models in this fashion shoot, and by the end it would be reduced to scattered limbs or one of the insects being eaten, and really documenting this is real life that we can make beautiful, that we're merging the ideas and the worlds of fashion photography and nature photography to really create something that is distinctly beautiful. So thanks for watching your lecture today. Hopefully you can think about the digital revolution and how this idea that we no longer take images, that we create them, has affected your life and the way that you work within photography. Thanks for watching.